You are listening to Seeking the Hidden Thing with Kryptos. Welcome to another episode of Seeking the Hidden Thing podcast, everyone. It is my distinct pleasure to have with me today John Slaughter, an Athenian stranger, and we are going to be talking about why you should take Marx seriously, why you should read him. I know that in the past, it has been easy to draw a demarcation line between, Americans who believe in free market and freedom and so forth, and the evil communists who are totalitarians and want to take your freedom away. And it has been common for people to describe their enemy as communists and so forth. And unfortunately, the result of that is that nobody takes Karl Marx seriously in a way that they probably should. And so I'm having John and Athenian on to talk about why you actually may want to just take some time and read Marx and digest some of his writing. So welcome, John. Welcome, Athenian. Hopefully we can have a good discussion around this.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, maybe I should just let you start it off, because you've talked about this before. I don't know whether it was with me or with Oren, but I know you've gone through this topic at some point in the past, and for whatever reason, it keeps coming up, and you keep having to explain patiently to people why, no, actually, you should read Karl Marx and take him seriously.
Yeah, no, I think it was maybe a year and a half ago. I was on Oren's show discussing this, and then I had to suffer, a month or so being called a Marxist for engaging with his work at all. The big thing that turned me on to it was when I started to actually read Marx, and I came upon, his use of the term alienation, which, if I remember correctly, it kind of disappears from his writing around maybe 1848 or something. He stops using the term, and he really does warp it from when he gets it from Hegel and all. But when I come across this term and I realize that what he's really speaking to, at least, well, you should draw a line between academic Marxism and then Marxism that appeals to the workers, right? And with the academic Marxism, you can get into the weeds and look at alienation, look at commodity fetish or dialectical materialism, any of that stuff. But I realized that's not what the average person that became a quote unquote Marxist or a socialist was thinking, right? And that what Marx was really sort of appealing to with the workers were the conditions that were thrust upon them in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, right? So, they are alienated. They're ripped from the land, essentially. They're forced into factories. They're getting low pay, long hours, unsafe working conditions. And all of a sudden, Marx comes along, and Marx had a particular disdain for the workers, right? Because when he talked with them, or the German factory workers, he realized, I think he called them drunks and unsophisticated, because they weren't interested in the philosophy of Marx at all. What they really cared about was, at least in my reading, is that he's saying these things like you're exploited, the workers will unite, you have nothing to lose but your change, and your chains, and this is speaking to these people who have had their entire life rearranged, right? They're alienated from their community bonds, their families, the land they used to work, that freedom they had of being able to live off the work that they provided through their trades or through working the land was all gone. And I think it's important to understand that that's what appealed to people. And if you just ignore that and you say, well, that's not worth paying attention to, the next time that situation arises, and I personally think that the AI or automated revolution, however you want to phrase it, has the potential to be analogous to the Industrial Revolution, right? And will alienate people. It's probably worth going back and looking at Marx and going, okay, well, why was this so intoxicating? to the average person. And why did it spread so quickly? Because it could very well do so again in another form, if that makes sense.
Well, I tend to agree with you. And, those that analyze it, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's numerous authors in the late 1800s, early 20th century who pick up on Marx's analysis for other, like you think, a right-wing author like Carl Schmitt, but you would be surprised when you dive into Carl Schmitt's writings, how seriously he takes Marx and how seriously he takes Marxism. And, he understands that, there's a fundamental contradiction that if Marx is, what Marx is saying is that, there's an inevitability to history and that this is all just going to happen, then it doesn't need people to make it happen. So, as you say, the Marxist theories appealed to the intelligentsia because they believed that they could be instrumental in orchestrating it and making it happen, and then also in raising the consciousness of the worker to make the utopian future that Marx had envisioned a reality, this egalitarian utopianism. And I think that's really what many of the intelligentsia latch onto. But the common man, as you say, realizes that he's been ripped from the land, ripped from his community. The value of his labor has been stolen from him and given to factory owners. And he gets that in a very visceral sort of way. And what this made him vulnerable to or open to was actually the fascist, who then said to him, we're going to, spoke to history, tradition, all of these things that the factory worker, the now factory worker, realized was taken from him by the capitalist, the factory owner. And in many ways, the common man attached himself to fascism because in fascism, he saw a maybe more genuine possibility of a return to the life that he once lived and once knew before the factories. Even if the fascist wasn't promising him that, that was sort of what he placed onto sort of the blank slate of the mythologizing of fascism. The factory worker placed his hopes and aspirations onto that because he wanted to return to sort of the better Germany, or today the better America. So that idea of return is, and this is, I think, why it's very, very important to understand Marx, because you can't then understand what happened in fascism without understanding what happened in Marx. That, like Schmitt argues, that class and class dynamics are far less potent than ethnos and history and genos and all of those things that, community, that are far more important to the average man. He just wants to be well integrated in the source into a thriving community, have food on his plate and a rich life all around him, And so, fascism gave him that dream that in many ways even Marxism did not, which appealed to the academic and the intelligentsia. So it's kind of a funny dynamic that way.
Well, I just want to say real quick, to your point, what is I think evidence of this is how Marxist revolutions failed in countries that had a somewhat stable and already established industrialized society, right? And fascism was able to, like in Italy is the prime example of this, right? Mm-hmm. That wins out in Italy, and I think largely due to the fact that sort of at the lowest level, the leveling effect of Marxism does not work when people at least can afford, as you said, like they can put food on their table and things like that, as opposed to Russia or China, where you're going from essentially you have a serf class, right? They did not have the industrialized society that was able to sort of, I guess, rebuke that sort of lowest level of Marxism, which is kind of ironic if you look back at the fact that in Orthodox Marxism, like you said, you require the capitalist state is required as a precursor. There's sort of this teleology that the purpose of the capitalist state is to give birth to to that. So it's kind of ironic that actually worked as a buffer.
You see that also in China and other places too, where they come from semi-agrarian societies, and then they take, the great leap sort of thing, right? But yeah, so that I think it was Del Noce who highlighted that for me, that this bifurcation, that Marx ended up appealing to the academic, even though it was, the ideas in many ways were supposed to speak to what was happening among the working classes, whereas fascism actually spoke to the working classes.
Do you think that's because of the nature? It's progressive, right? The notion of progress, because this socialist utopia is inevitable, right? And so for the academics, this idea of progress and moving forward, that was progress. So they latched onto that.
Well, I think the thing is that in the academic side, what ended up becoming, communism and socialism, is that you sweep aside the present order to then open up the possibility for the glorious future. Whereas with fascism, you sweep aside the present order to reinstantiate a idyllic past, in a sense, so this mythic past is then essentially in the greatness of the German people, right? So it's, you hate to say it, but it's like, make Germany great again, right? And so there is, and the comparisons I think are apt, and this is why I think too as well, not only to take Marx seriously, why you should take fascism as an intellectual movement seriously as well too, because it helps you to understand the present day. But what's interesting is that both movements are utopian, and both movements are also, they're post-Nietzschean in a sense that they don't, like, the fascist doesn't really believe in the myths he's trying to reinstantiate, right? So they're both post-Nietzschean, and they're both fully use the sort of the technological society. So in some sense, both end up being technologically progressive. So they're both going to harness technology, but they're going to do so in a way where, and a lot of this stuff is just, once you begin to explain it, you're like, how could anyone really think that this is actually going to work? But, you're going to make Germany great again, but you're going to do it through technology while somehow reinstantiating all of these old myths. And for the Marxist, you're going to, there's some sort of this internegum, this sort of period of sort of managed whatever, but you sweep aside the present order, but nobody really gets rid of sort of the foundational technological society that kind of makes everything work anyways, it's just kind of, and that's I think ultimately why Ellul in the end ended up abandoning Marxism himself to focus on the technological society, and why Burnham abandoned Marxism to focus on the managerial society, because both realized that there was something deeper at work in what was happening than what Marx was telling them was going, or Hegel and Marx were telling them, or even, Gramsci and other, like the fascist were telling them as well. So anyways, Athenian, I should probably let you chime in here too as well.
Yeah, I have a funny story about my dealing with Marx. So in graduate school, I was in the philosophy department, but I spent all my time in the politics department because of my specialty, in the classic thinkers, and that was their specialty. And so I slipped through the loophole. Normally, you're not allowed to take any more than at most 2 classes outside of your specialty. And I just took I had more classes in the politics department than the philosophy department. But it was around the time of Obama. And see, we only did seminar courses on like one thinker, one text, right? We didn't do that, motorcycle tour through the Louvre. And the professor who was the best, I'm sort of like, he's the guy I owe so much to. At the end of one of our semesters on a Platonic dialogue, everyone wants to know what he's going to teach next semester. And he said, we pride ourselves on not teaching anything in this department after 1789, unless it has to do with America. He said, but since Marxism is everywhere, I'm thinking I'll teach a course on Marx, because this was, like I said, around the time of Obama and stuff. And so, we took the course on Marx. And so just to sort of immediately answer the question of like what Slaughter was talking about with, and you as well, saying people need to at least read Marx to sort of be familiar with him. What they'll want to have is a kind of one text source. It's the standard. It's the Marx Engels Reader. It's edited by Tucker. It's the red book, right? I mean, that's the one that they'll want, because it has the best selection, and of the best translations, etc. And that's also, by the way, the sort of the standard text that most people are going to go to, that most authors who comment about Marx refer to if they refer to an English translation. Now, that being said, the important thing that what I would want people to take away from this discussion, at least on my end, is that the thing about Marxism that's important is that what you have with Marxism, I mean, it's multifaceted of why we have to at least take it seriously, which is not to say that we agree with any of it. What you get with Marxism is a critique of capitalism that really issues directly from this notion, like what Slaughter had mentioned about, alienation, but it's, I mean, which is the term he gets from Hegel. It literally is right in the center of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. But what it is that it is addressing the issue of industrialization, right? That's exactly like what Slaughter had mentioned there a second ago about that's what's new under the sun. It used to be the case that everyone had, you had a stake in your labor, your work, right? Because I mean, it was yours. You had the farm and stuff like that. But because of the nature of capitalism and sort of the unleashing of self-interest, you have some people who are just really good at it, and they're in any given industry, and they're able to come in and just dominate. And the next thing you know, you've got entire corporations that own entire industries, and the mom and pop farm, the mom and pop, all that, this gone. Those days are gone. So what happens? And it's even more complicated than that, because now you have this new thing, division of labor, right? And that's going to be what Marx is really going to pivot everything on. But that's the thing, is that that's not going away. The issues that we feel as far as being a cog in the wheel, right? It's like, I'm just a cog in a wheel, man. I could go to work and just answer a few emails and I'll still get paid for the whole day, and I'd fall asleep in my chair, right? I mean, it's like, I don't do anything. They just pay me to work, like that kind of stuff. That's not going away. That is the problem of technology. And Marx is addressing this because the issue is what happens now, because see, all of that creates this other new thing under the sun that we call the middle class. And you've got the workers, the middle class, blah, blah, blah. It's sort of stratified. And that's, Marx is addressing that. And he does it in a way that is so unique. You see this, and this is why whenever you talk about Marxism, you have to make sure you talk about the varieties of Marx. Like what Marxism are we talking about when most people mention it? Well, that's going to be different than Marx's Marxism, because what happens is that what's so unique about Marx is that his thought gets taken up by an entire political party in 1875 that then for that last quarter of the 19th century is not just the most prominent and powerful political party in Germany. It's the most prominent and powerful and effective in all of Europe. I mean, that's how big it is, right? And because a few key leaders in that party were so convinced that Marx's thought was true, they make Marx's thought the official ideology of the party. And then it's going to get even a little more complicated, because then you have Lenin. Lenin comes in, right? So, and then it ends up getting over to Russia. And then with the dominance of Russia and Lenin's hand in things, Lenin is the one who demands that all Western socialist parties, which is to say, under the sway of Marxist thought, imitate Leninist Russia, right? Or I'm sorry, Leninist Marxism. And then, because of Stalin, and then the fall, right after, we're talking 1930 or so, with the fall of all of that, with the fallout of all of that, everyone is embarrassed. And they're like, okay. And so you have this mad rush of all the academics in the world, in the Western world, going back to Marx. Now I should have mentioned that the key texts that are used by that party, it's the Social Democratic Party of Germany that it ends up being all of Europe. The key texts were always the Communist Manifesto and Capital, Das Kapital, right? Those are the two texts. That's what gets known as Marxism in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and then transformed by Lenin. Then, when everyone's embarrassed because of what Stalin has done under the name of Marx, everyone in the Western world who are the academics rush back into Marx, because what they want to do is they're like, we've got to put a better face on Marx, right? Because, I mean, they feel like there are things that are true about it, right? Alienation and stuff like that. But they end up discovering these manuscripts that weren't even really found for the most part until the 1940s, 1930s. And there's three of them. And this is going to be the new Marxism, right? This is going to be the Marxism that now people start talking about. But it's the so-called young Marx, the so-called humanistic Marx. And it's grounded primarily, so you have this text, the German ideology. You have the Grundrisse, which is an early draft of Capital. And then you have the Economic and Philosophical Manuscript of 1844. Now, that last one, the Economic Philosophical Manuscript, that's going to be, there has been no text in this that has more defined the 20th century politics than that one, along with German ideology. But that's where they claim to have found the humanist Marx. And that's the one that we end up dealing with. But see, Marx himself, Slaughter pointed it out. In those texts, Marx is still using the language of alienation. That changes when you get to Das Kapital, right? Marx is no longer using that. It's almost verboten, right? He hates the word so much, and he changes it. And this is what's so absolutely hilarious. And Slaughter mentioned it. He begins now. He's using the word. It's a phrase. The fetish of commodities, right? Commodity fetishism, right? I mean, that's how bad it is. That's how bad capitalism is, et cetera. And it's not just, and see, this is why all the academics loved it. And we have to worry about the academics because they're the one who had been teaching this crap to the youth. All the academics were intoxicated with Marx. That's what's amazing when I find out some of the guys whose books I've read where I'm like, man, this is great scholarship. And then you find out they were a Marxist. You're like, what the hell? How can you be that stupid? But you sort of have to understand that it swooped over the entire world, because Marx his thought had been used as the ideology. And we get that word ideology from Marx. It's from that text, German ideology. Because what happens, and see, people are going to say that what Marx does is he turns Hegel on his head. All right, fine. What does that mean? What are we even talking about here? Well, that's because what Marx does is he's going to effectively say that the origin of truth itself is the working laborer, right? It's not going to be this is his fundamental critique of Hegel. And he's getting this from Feuerbach, by the way. These guys were too theoretical. No one can even understand their language. They're hard to read. Who gets this, right? But we do get that there's a problem in the world, very serious problem of what's happening in our daily lives. And apparently these people are talking about it, but I can't understand what the hell they're doing. And so that's what Marx does, following Feuerbach, is that he makes it to where not only does he throw out all of the technical, just unbelievably difficult philosophy that's involved in it, the terminology and everything, but he brings it immediately back home to the working man, right? And that's what's hard. It's hard to get away from that because everyone just loves that. And another reason, by the way, you guys had mentioned, how did people even become intoxicated with Marx in the first place? Well, there's a number of reasons, but what I would submit is one of the primary reasons is that Marx flatly says in his critique of Hegel, which is one of his earliest writings, the opening line is that the critique has to begin with a critique in religion, right? Academics have long they've hated the Christians, they've hated anyone. And that goes back, by the way, to the understanding of liberalism itself, because they just do not believe that you can have the kind of freedom, right? That's the key thing, the freedom, so long as you're surrounded still by any of these sort of religious zealots. That's the real point of Marx's first essay, the Jewish question, right? The emancipation of the Jews or whatever. The whole point is that no, because then they're still under the pressure of civil society. And that's the key right there, is that's what's new under the sun. We have the state on one hand, right? The all big nation state. And then that's what this is, because this is the definition of liberalism for all of German ideology. And really, this goes all the way to, this is in British stuff too. This is Adam Smith and everything. This is Rousseau, all of them. This is what defines liberalism. You have the so-called civil society. In other words, that's where you're free to be the person you want. In other words, you have elbow room, right? You can be freedom of conscience, right? That's the realm, right? That's the civil realm. And then there's the state. Well, how do these things go together? Because for the state, you have laws to be the citizen. But in civil society, you don't have laws anymore. You just have the majority. You have, right, popular opinion, Tocqueville's tyranny of the majority. That's what these guys are addressing. In other words, how do we reconcile these two things when it turns out that the freedom that liberalism says is their greatest new thing under the sun within the realm of the civil society? What happens when that clashes with the freedom that the state it has to institute certain laws for citizens, right? What happens when those things collide? And most people feel that. Most people feel it very powerfully in their working lives, in their day jobs, right? That's where that's where they see the disparities, the unfairness, the law, right? And that's why Marx is he will always and forever be intoxicating to people, because that's what he's got his finger on the pulse of, and he strips it of all of its fancy philosophical language, and he brings it right back to the majority of people, which majority, by the way, that's the Russian word for the Bolsheviks. That's why Lenin used the name the Bolsheviks for his Leninist Marxism. It's the majority, it's the working man, it's everyone. We can all relate, right? So that's going to be sort of the key there. Anyway, that was a long ramble. Sorry.
Well, it's one of the couple of thoughts. One is, I think, fundamentally, if you boil it all down to, why does it appeal? Like you say, why does it appeal? Is because everybody instinctively knows, even if they can't put their finger on it, something has been taken from you. And that something has been given to the industrialist who now sits who presides over your life and who, is in control of your livelihood. And, that, I think, even if people can't articulate it, that resonates. And, I don't know if you want to add anything, John.
The only thing I wanted to add, I guess, is that I think it is important to note that the Marxist conception of freedom is very different. A lot of people don't realize that the tie between freedom and necessity, which becomes circular if you're reading Marx, it's very circular, right? So it's self-referential, and it doesn't really. So even though he does bring things down, like Athenian said, he's still kind of difficult to read for most people. Like when you start getting into it, because things start to self-define themselves, but their conception of freedom is, and the way that I explain it to people is that in their sort of framework, the worker in the socialist utopia has all of his needs, all the things that are necessary provided to him, and that is freedom. So it doesn't matter that he's enslaved to the state, essentially. he is still more free than the factory worker in London who gets to go fishing on the weekend, right? And this freedom and necessity, and one of the reasons I keep harping on Marx to people is that my concern is that if things go a certain way with automation, that same sort of necessity is going to justify sort of totalitarian power over everybody else, if that makes sense. So that authoritarian control would be justified by its necessity in AI, no different than the necessity people are delivered from necessity, quote unquote, under Marxism, which justifies all of the sort of the atrocities in Marx, right? Because as long as you're driving towards that utopia, all things are sort of justified, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Let me add real quickly. Of course, I mean, Slaughter's right. And I would also add, because I didn't mention this, is that even in the so-called early Marx, young Marx, whatever, you still have all of the things that were, just as bad as that ended up happening with it, which all the Marxists were embarrassed about. Because, I mean, his atheism is unlike anything you've ever seen before. I mean, he kind of makes Nietzsche look like an altar boy almost. And so there's the claim, that the later Marx is not the same as the early Marx and blah, blah, blah. That's not really true in the most fundamental sense. And so no matter what people say about being a Marxist or whatever, they're going to be tied to the fact that just like what John was saying, the notion of freedom in Marx is almost, I mean, it's very, whether you're at the young Marx, I mean, that's part of the so-called turning Hegel on his head. The dialectical in Hegel is fundamentally concerned with consciousness, and where that word alienation comes up in Hegel's phenomenology is exactly, I mean, it's just amazing, because then all of a sudden Marx becomes perfectly clear. It's literally the section titled culture, right? So alienation occurs in Hegel by way of consciousness cultivating itself. And, there's this process that goes wrong. Well, I mean, not goes wrong, but I mean, the pain and the suffering that goes through it is of necessity. For Marx, it has nothing to do with thought. That's the whole point of beginning with critique. That's why there's so much Marxist hermeneutics, right? Because everything is critique. That's where your critical theory. Because everything has to, Marx is blowing up the very possibility of what would otherwise be called ideology, right? The notion that ideas are what move history. No, it's not. It's all praxis, right? It's all production. It's all the sight of the working laborer. The freedom that people think they might have with Marxism, Marx would look at it and say, you haven't understood me at all. That's not freedom. You're just still the bourgeois, right? You're still like, no, you're wrong, right? I mean, so that even the ones who think they've reformed Marx have failed to really understand the depths of what they're signing on to, with his understanding of the human being as such. The human being as such it doesn't exist until he's the laborer. And then even then, once he's the working laborer, everything he does is not really part of his conscious psyche. That's the motion of history that's working through these economic predictions that Marx doesn't provide. See, what Hegel does, Hegel provides an intricate, very rich psychology. Marx turns that upside down and says, no, it's all materiality. It's all materials. So the material means of production. It's not your mind. It's not ideas. So that's part of the inversion there that takes place. That people just don't understand it for the most part. But they love to say they're Marxist because that justifies. See, the thing about Marxism and what Marx says makes man evil is that the system itself is evil. Capitalism is evil. And so even if you might think you're a good person, right? You're this capitalist or something who still goes to church. No, you are fundamentally evil because you are participating in the system itself. And that's what these revolutionaries, these people, many of the self-hating people, right? Even we see it today in America. They're so angry about what's happened in America. They just want to watch it all burn. And so it's very easy for them to go along with these sort of revolutionary Marxist kind of ideas and become these Marxists right? I mean, that's what Antifa is. And they don't even know what they're signing on for. They're just so full of hatred at the system and seeing it as being so evil, and anyone that even participates in it is evil, that they take to the streets in mobs, you know?
Well, and that's an interesting segue into some of the thoughts that I had too, is that this idea, like the revolutionary idea, is one of these ones that I think, and this is, I think, what ultimately has Ellul breaking from Marxism, even though, like Ellul, I tend to be more of a structuralist in that sense. Not to say like that history has this grand movement to it, like Hegel or Marx would say, that there's an inevitability to it. But the idea of systemic problems is real, and that you build a system up, and then the system itself supports it. Now the question is like, if you sweep away the system, will utopia emerge? And to me, that's an idea that has to be rejected, because that's the basic religious core of Marxism. But you have to understand Marx in order to understand, like, when you're calling for tearing down the system, you're basically trying to reenact, a fundamentally revolutionary, that is ultimately Marxist idea. Or, if you go back to the French Revolution, it's sort of a leftist idea that then becomes a Marxist idea. But, and Marxism gets woven into our consciousness through Rousseau, right? So if you begin with a blank slate, that people are good, and then you take into sort of idea that the fundamental atheism of Marx, that religion is really, the opiate of the masses. It's put to service for the powerful to maintain their economic position over you and their economic oppression of you. So you need to get, in that sense, religion is the enemy. And then, but with this, you have this also this rise, so the intelligentsia, they'll latch onto Rousseau's idea of education, that we can, through education, create the sort of the kind of context where people emerge good. They no longer are flawed or whatever, because we can educate them into, and then that sort of morphs more broadly into the managerial society, or the idea that we can engineer all of society, sort of that's sort of the socialism side of Marxism. But what ends up happening is that the atheism of Marx gets absorbed, but it's like utopian revolutionary. The religious aspect of Marx gets kind of set aside for the managerial side. And so this is, again, what Burnham and others then identify, is that progressivism sort of takes the core of Marx, sort of marries it with Rousseau, and then you now have this, and then you couple it with the idea of progress, and then gradually we're just going to manage our way into, like Fukuyama's The End of History, right? And then the enemy becomes the traditionalist who wants to go back to old ways of life. Right. And so you can see how, in a sense, Marx ended up winning, even though communist Russia ended up losing. Because if you think of how the debate went with communist Russia, well, how did we, so people would look at like the failed industrial policies of Russia and say, well, look at America. What's so good about America? Well, in America, we can provide plenty and abundance. We've got blue jeans, and they don't have blue jeans in Russia. And basically what happened is, rather than challenging it and saying that, no, the problem with it is not that they're not succeeding at providing the material well-being of the people and the material needs of the people. The problem with Marxism is that it's fundamentally flawed. It has a flawed spiritual core. And so in America, then they embrace the fundamental atheism, the focus that on that material goods, we can solve all of our problems material, because we've got blue jeans, we've got, houses with air conditions and television sets and full shelves in the grocery store. We're inherently better materialists than the Russian communists who are losing. So in a sense, capitalism embraces the spiritual core of Marxism and becomes hyper-capitalism. So in a sense, in this way, Marx wins, even while communist Russia loses, because America, in a sense, becomes the materialist place. And now you can see this then sort of with the reaction against religion and the sexual revolution and everything. And it all kind of comes in because how do you keep the religious people down? Well, you do it through, making them all look like backwards and prudes and so forth and so forth. And again, like you were talking about, Athenian, that it comes down to this whole thing of liberating people from the bondage that they were in. And the bondage that they're in is this sort of narrow-minded religious view. So in a sense, progressivism, then market capitalism, which becomes hyper-capitalism, because if we're going to solve all of the people's problems through material abundance, we have to just maximize the amount of material abundance we have. And that will really solve all of the problems that people have. But yet fundamentally, the core problems that Marx identified on that side of the alienation people experience from their labor, from each other, and from, and then, well, he wouldn't say from God, but the fundamental alienation that people feel, that problem still hasn't been solved. And so you have then, the thing that you're hammering on all the time, that the nihilism problem just still sort of hangs out there within the, sort of the victory over, in the victory of Marx's atheism. The nihilism problem just sort of kind of hangs out there off to the side that nobody's found a way to solve it. I mean, progressivism was supposed to form the new religion that then would solve it, but everybody's realized that, well, progressivism just leaves people empty anyways. But now here we are. And so, it's hard to understand the current moment that we're in if you don't have a reasonable grasp of Marx's philosophy on the totality of it. Because you can't understand the transformations that occurred within our society without understanding the importance of Marx's atheism and how that works itself out in society and how it transforms itself into progressive managerialism. If that makes sense.
Let me just, I can't emphasize this enough. The reason it is important for people to at least read Marx to understand him is that they will not understand the 20th century at all if they have not got a decent familiarity with some of the most basic of Marx's writings, because they will not understand how it is the fact that all of these supposedly great academics, right? All of them, almost to a man, they just couldn't get enough Marx, right? I mean, they were all Marxists. I mean, you find, everyone was a Marx. I mean, the way that everyone in academia today is a nihilist, everyone in the 20th century, if they weren't already nihilists, I mean, they were Marxists, right? So all of the events of history, if you set aside, again, just to sort of just drive this point home, people use the word ideology like it's just an answer, like it's just a given. Tell them that word did not even exist prior to Marx, and they won't. Well, what word are we supposed to use? That is how blinded they would be without a familiarity with Marx, right? I mean, that's the whole point. Is that
the ideology masks what these things really are functioning as, which is religious belief. But you can't say religious belief because religion is the opiate of the masses. And so it has to be transformed into something that's just purely philosophical, cleansed of sort of any religious pretense.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
but it's ultimately utopian.
Yeah. I mean, they were also, everyone became so intoxicated with history having a telos that, it's almost like everything became utopian in the hands of, 19th and early 20th century. So.
Well, and that is in many ways, kind of I think another thing that you need to see is that all three of the major Western philosophies, fascism, Marxism, and liberalism, are all fundamentally utopian. And, you could say like liberalism, capitalism, right, together, that they are all fundamentally utopian. And, people talk about, market capitalism as it's just sort of like the laws of the market. But there is always a utopian drive. If we just let the market play out, it will provide the kind of abundance that will end need and want. And that's sort of, nobody ever really kind of says it out loud that way as a religious impulse, but it is. And all three of these impulses are ultimately atheistic, and then your alternative to the three/4 major philosophies of the late 1800s, early 20, in the 1900s is, in the 19th and 20th century is then a living religious faith that offers an alternative to, and this I think is really why understanding Marx is important then. For if you're going to lay out a religious alternative to the 20th century, you have to be able to grapple with all three of these seriously. You cannot, in a sense, absent capitalism from, and say that, well, we need to be capitalist because that's the opposite of Marxism, which, it's just as atheistic as Marx is. And you can try to whitewash it with Bible verses, but you're doing basically the same thing as the liberation theologian. And you have to understand that that's what you're doing. People don't like to hear these things, but that's the truth of it. And, reading Marx helps you to understand the nature of the way that capitalism both won and lost at the same time.
I think one way for people to kind of understand, and maybe I'm misreading, this is just my interpretation looking at it, is that in every aspect, whether it's through, liberalism, fascism, communism, they're all trying to deal with this fact that man has lost his purpose, his meaning, and his dignity, right? Because of technology to some capacity. They are all only addressing this loss through a material lens, right? In some capacity. And that creates an inability to truly address the problem. And because of that, I always tell people that I think Bismarck is a good person to look at of trying to combat, as Athenian was saying, the Socialist Party becomes extremely powerful in Germany. Bismarck is able to sort of cut the legs out from under them temporarily by addressing some of the material concerns through his, through some of his changes, like offering, elderly insurance and things like this. But this is only temporary, right? Because it does not address the fundamental issue. It can only slow down this problem. And so I think at the end of the day, when you're looking at this, it's kind of an issue. It's the only way to combat it is to find a way to return man, to give him purpose and dignity back. Because without that, these material conditions are going to be the only avenue that he is going to have available to try and do that, and they're always going to fail.
That's such a good point, John. Yeah, go ahead, Athenian.
Let me add even a finer point to what John just said. What's going on when you go even further down that road of logic, is that what liberalism offers, which is to say what the world around us offers. I mean, the whole world is on board now for the most part. I understand China and some of these other places, and so that's kind of the clash and stuff. But just think about what we know in America, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's your problem right there. They only tell you the pursuit of happiness. See, that's what liberalism is that's that separation between on the one hand at the level of the state, and then civil society, which is to say ethical society and versus like being a citizen, right? The flourishing of man proper, right? To have his own freedom of consciousness, right? Conscience, and then the laws of being a citizen. That's the elbow room. The elbow room is they say, okay, you're free to pursue happiness. And in fact, we're not going to tell you what happiness is. That's you get to place content in that thing. And what we are finding is that when everything has been built around these notions of self-interest for aggrandizement, whether it's a great 401k, early retirement, these kind of things, that what is happening is that's not satisfying people. That's, in other words, we're finding out the problems that were built into that. And young people have now seen this, and they don't even want to give capitalism a shot anymore. And so then, well, where do you go if you don't give capitalism a shot? Well, they're going to become these Marxist, socialist, whatever. I mean, it's all sort of part of the same thing. So these two competing ideologies there. But that's the point, is that, and we fool ourselves, right? Most people fool themselves to simply say, like, if you listen to a lot of the political discourse, at least in America, the stuff, I mean, are these people actually answering what is happiness supposed to be? Because people don't know, and by the means through which you have built your country, America, they're not able to find this happiness, right? I mean, they've even got songs, right? More money, more problems, these kind of things. Now, that shouldn't happen. How does that happen, right? Something's gone wrong, and so that's what needs to be addressed, and no one's really addressing it, because they can't, right? Because if the politicians address it, that's going too far, right? Because they're always going to have some kind of an answer with respect to the divine. They're not going to do that, because that's not going to get them votes, right? They have to continue speaking in these things called values and stuff like that, and vagaries of, you too can, have a happy life. Sir, what is happy? Look, man, just vote for me and you'll have happiness, right? Something like that.
What, and the other concern, and this is, I think, the danger of our current moment, once again, this the bugaboo, Christian nationalism, it's, out there. And, my concern with it all is that it instrumentalizes, something that is essentially a religious question, spiritual question, like John was talking about. You have to answer the question of the fundamental alienation, which is ultimately a spiritual and religious question. And capitalism, liberalism, communism, fascism, none of them answer that fundamental religious alien question. And one of the things that I worry about is that instead of answering the fundamental spiritual question, I want to live in a Christian society, and I think living in a Christian society is better than living in a pagan one, or even, a materialist society, a consumerist materialist society that's atheistic. But I worry that we're going to, in our rush to reinstantiate a Christian society, we're just going to redo Kant all over again, which is to turn our Christian faith into a set of policy prescriptions that we're going to enact into law and then believe that we've re-Christianized society, when we have not really answered the question of how do people connect with God and with each other, right? And then also with themselves. And so there is, I think, and this is where there's the massive opportunity, because the question in the 20th century just kind of hangs out there. It's like, what do we do with the technological society, and how do we find meaning? And, how do we make our lives worth anything? Is just getting up and grinding for 50 hours a week every week so I can fill my 401k. Is that really what it's all about? And those of us who are Christians know that that's not what it's all about, but we don't have a meaningful alternative. And, and this is, I guess, the question of, my alternative is not necessarily to sweep aside the present order, because I'm not a revolutionary, but at the same time, I think we would be much better served answering sort of small ball, questions of, in our church, in our life, what kind of steps can we take to reintegrate ourselves with our own labor, with ourselves, with God, with each other, and to address the fundamental crisis. And, like I say, we keep coming back to this, is that it is in reading Marx that you begin to realize that alienation, / nihilism are really, this is the core issue that we face, even deeper than, tariffs or the economy. And here's the other thing, the fact that the economy is the central issue in most people's lives tells you that Marx has won, because he tells you that material reality is the most important thing for most people's lives. Now, I get that you have to eat, you have to put food on the table and clothes on your back, but in any properly ordered society where, like, in a quote unquote Christian society, how the economy is doing is not necessarily your number one question. It's, are we as a people right with God? And that's a very, very, and I think we've just completely lost that question. It's almost so lost to us, even for us as Christians, that just to kind of contemplate, like, of course you have to worry about the economy. You know what I mean? Like, worrying about the thing, that's what church is for. And we've interiorized all of these ideas largely because we've interiorized Marx's materialism.
Well, and I think this is going to get worse. My concern, and the reason I keep wanting to address this question, is because I think that the AI thing becomes alienation 2.0. So instead it becomes, AI will free you because it frees you from work. And that is only going to amplify the loss of dignity and purpose and meaning people have. And that,
you're not filling the hole.
Exactly. You're not, and then you're just leaving people open. And so maybe you come up with, you end up in this weird way leapfrogging into what Marx always wanted, which is you are in this socialist state where they just have to pay you to exist, right? That's going to be an even worse form of nihilism, because you could argue that at least being a cog in the machine gives you a little bit of purpose, but now you have no purpose whatsoever.
Yeah, that's why you legalize pot.
That? Yeah. And if we don't address this now, it's going to get 10 times worse than I think it was before.
Yeah. And like, I mean, I realize that, like, the 1700s or the 1600s were not idyllic in any, it was a hard life for the vast majority of people. But on the one hand, they had certain things that we did not have, which were communities that functioned, and they had, by and large, for most people, a functioning, living spiritual life. Were they all saints? No, but yeah.
Well, the essay that I'm working on now, and I'll probably have it out next week if I'm lucky, is that my general idea is that it's a scale issue. That the only way out of this is to scale down. Yes. It's the size. You cannot have these things when you have, even at the scale of the United States, it's too much. You have to have localized. The answer in some capacity is to localize where those communal bonds can reemerge. Now, how you get there, I don't know, but I don't think it's possible until you scale down.
That's right. And you have to think about your world in a scaled down world. And that, I mean, how you get there is because, and this is the dilemma. And I get into this with people on Twitter all the time, right? Is, well, if you build these small communities or whatever, you scale down, somebody who wants to scale up will just crush you. And they're absolutely right. That's why people scaled up in the first place. And that's why, the businessman who scaled up was able to crush the small, like the hometown businessman, the small grocer, the guy who ran his little shop. Yeah, they scaled up and squashed them and ran them out of business. But the result is the world that we live in now. And so you can't find what we're looking for without living at a smaller scale. And that means giving up something. Like, you can't keep your world and save it at the same time. It's that old biblical, you can't keep your life and save it at the same time. You have to, and I know a lot of Americans are not wanting to hear Westerners more broadly, but, when we say, you repent and believe, what do we have to repent of? Well, being hyper-capitalist liberals who quit, and that's, and I think these are the things that people need to really seriously think about. That the more that you want to save capitalism, the more you're trying to save the fundamental materialism that's at root in it. And that it, and I think that in many ways they go, Marx is a product of the capitalist society in that regard. Like Marx, I think what makes Marx possible is capitalism. And then because Marx exposes the dark underside of capitalism and makes you look at it. And that's really the thing that people don't want to see. And maybe that's the deeper question, is that what Marx does is he forces you to look at capitalism and to see it for what it is. People don't want to see it because they think that they can fix capitalism and keep all the benefits of it, but you can't. Yeah, there we go. Did I freeze up or no? Everybody's just sort of like, but we're at 59 minutes. So maybe that's, my little rant there at the end is maybe, unless does either of you have one last thing that you want to add?
I was waiting for a lecture from Athenian. That's what I was waiting on.
No. I'm all my powder is blown. I mean, the only thing I would have left to add would, if I start getting into the philosophy of it. I mean, I guess the takeaway, my way to end at least my contributions to this would be that what people are going to find, at least in the literature, when they look into this, is there's two different kinds of books on Marx, right? I just always assume everyone's an autodidact. I mean, we're in the business of re-educating ourselves because our educators failed us. And so you're going to find two different kinds of books on Marx. I mean, I hope you get the Marx Engels reader and just start reading, but there are the books that address primarily, and these are the vast majority of books, the concept of Marx's so-called social critique of capitalism or what have you, right? It's his social philosophy, right? And then you're going to have the books that are dedicated primarily to the actual inner workings of the philosophy itself. And this is where, like Slaughter had mentioned, because Marx is doing both at the same time in all of his essays. It's just not as on the surface with the terminology that Hegel has. Dialectical materialism, there is philosophy to it. Now, whether one finds it persuasive or not, I mean, I don't. But, I mean, one has to be aware of it because you're going to cross paths with these Marxists, and it's almost like they're robots. Talk about automaton. They just start spitting out this claptrap about the diet. I mean, it's such a closed circle. It's like you can't even engage in conversation with them unless you engage on their terms. And it's like,
they're driven by history, Athenian. So that's
yeah. So that's what people are going to find is the philosophy, the actual genuine or claim to philosophy in Marx, and then the social aspect of it, which I think we've all been addressing, which is most helpful, because you have to understand that's the great appeal of Marx. That's why we have so many Marxists, is because his critique of the social conditions of modern man come across, at least at a first glance, as like, that's kind of right. And then people ask themselves, they say, well, I mean, if I'm critiquing capitalism, I mean, does that have to make me a Marxist? And see, then you've got alternatives, because we have a whole tradition in the West of thinkers that were critiquing capitalism, and they weren't Marxists. And so there's always these options. But we have been so flooded with Marxism for over a century now that people don't even recognize that, there even is, like, what is the alternative to critique capitalism outside of Marxism? They don't know that there's an entire world of it, but I mean, we've got to start somewhere. So at least start with reading yourself some Marx to familiarize it, because you're gonna find a lot of your own tendencies or a lot of other people's tendencies in there and be like, that's it's kind of scary. I didn't know that I was that close to being a Marxist or something like that. So anyway.
Actually, a really good way, and it's not necessarily a critique of capitalism per se, but of the technological society, is read The Lord of the Rings. And then ask yourself, why does Tolkien spend, 200 pages at the beginning of the book detailing the life of the Shire? And why does everything always come back to the Shire, the Shire, the Shire, the Shire, the Shire? Well, he's trying to tell you something about his sense of, what the world could be. which is, yeah, still one of the best critiques of modernity is the Lord of the Rings. Anything that you want to add, John, before we sign off here?
Yeah, the only other thing is, if you're wanting to look into it, the book that I personally found the most helpful outside of what y'all have already mentioned is Tyranny of Concepts, which is a critique of Marxism. It's I have a copy of it on my shelf. It's Gordon Leff wrote it, I think in the 50s. It was published in the University of Alabama Press, but it's a pretty good. He walks you through the philosophy of Marx and then kind of dissects it and shows where logic is circular or unreasonable. And he goes through everything about, and he shows you the roots in Hegel and all the other thinkers that he draws from and how he kind of warps their thinking to a degree. It's worth a read. It's a little dense, but if you want to get that into the weeds, I think it's a helpful way to kind of see the flaws, the inherent flaws in it that you might not notice on the surface level.
Very good. Well, anyways, thank you guys. Again, hopefully you don't have to spend the next several weeks, people in your mentions calling you a Marxist. I'm perfectly fine with that. With me, it's just I don't care. But so there we go. Anyways, John, Athenian, thank you for coming on and having this conversation. I really enjoyed it, I think, and hopefully it'll be helpful for the audience.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much.